All right, I want to start out by thanking everyone for using their lunches to spend some time with me to go over this. And I hope that it is both useful and things, you learn something new maybe or pull some new ideas away is kind of the hope of this. So a little background of this specifically. Here, the goal of this was essentially to basically over the past year or two, try to culminate together a lot of different real world problems that I've used AI to help me solve while being a software engineer. So while the examples in here are generally relatively simple because of the timeline and the ability to kind of get through it in an hour, the concepts that I'm going to go over and the kinds of problems I solve are things that I have personally used AI to assist with in solving essentially. So I'm hoping that this is kind of useful, kind of realistic-ish as best as it can be. Um, yeah, and I hope it's interesting as well. So and also, if any questions arise during this, feel free to please raise your hand. Maybe someone could chime in if I accidentally miss it. But yeah, you can ask questions as we go. It's meant to be open-ended as well. Um, yeah, so I will get started. So the goals here. So basically, I want to give a realistic usage of AI tools to solve real-world problems. I wanted to focus on how to use AI tools, but not specific AI tools being used. So the idea here is that this is meant to be tool agnostic, basically. So it doesn't matter if you're using ChatGPT, it doesn't matter if you're using Claude, Gemini, or any other AI tool. I tried to keep this agnostic in the sense that it's really about how to use AI and the kinds of problems you could use to try to leverage and solve with a tool. Um, in this specific one, again, I'm using Claude. It's just a personal preference of uh, success of using it and output of answers and stuff. But again, the tool's agnostic. Use what you like. And then I have an intentional choice of using chat versus an integrated IDE. So I know there are lots of different ways. You can use Cursor, Copilot. There's a bunch of ways you can have it physically in your IDE. You can either chat in your IDE or you can prompt it. But in this case, I am intentionally choosing to use a chat. I'm doing it because I personally, at this point, like the ability to control what I'm actually putting into the tool. And a lot of times when it has a larger scope and can see more things, sometimes I find that I get worse answers because it makes more assumptions on details that I really don't want it to see or understand for my explicit scenario. But again, there's nothing against that. There are probably great use cases where integrated is superior to chat, but that's just kind of a heads up for this specific meeting and why I have chosen to use a chat over other options. So before we get started, I wanted to give some disclaimers. So the first one is be cautious about content passed into AI tools. So you want to be very careful, no PII, nothing indicating your, servers and, IP addresses. You want to be very restrictive about the kind of things you put in for security perspectives. And I think the good way to think of it is like, if by chance what I was going to paste in, everyone in the world knew about, would I care? Or would the company care? Or would the customer care? And if the answer is maybe or yes, it's a bad idea, right? The second one is understand how to use tools or how the tool uses your data. So a lot of different models will use essentially different security around it. For example, a lot of them on like a free license, they'll use your information for training. They'll probably store it indefinitely on the server, and those can both be very high concerns, specifically working with customers and their appetite for security. A lot of the time, going up in paid models gives you more control over these things. For example, with Claude, if you have like the pro paid model, it will never use your data in training. And you can choose to basically not have it stored on the server, where if you flag it for deletion, it will be gone from the server. So it's very important to kind of understand your tool, because at the end of the day, generally, depending on what you're using, you don't want that data to persist anywhere, because if it's somewhere, it is possible, for someone to essentially hack in and steal it one day. So it's good to understand those, read your specific tools, read how they're intended to be used. Number three is verify your customer's expectation around tools. So there's a wide range of what customers are comfortable with. So you want to make sure that your specific customer you're working with is okay with the tool selection and its security model as well. Um, and the last one is more about when you're using the tools. Also, always double check and verify all output and code. If you don't understand it, don't use it, is kind of my personal motto. So never blindly trust AI. Don't blindly trust any of the code it gives you. And if you don't understand what it's work or what it's doing, even if it gives you the output you want, please don't use it. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't use it still, but that's kind of your preemptive idea that maybe if I don't understand it, I should ask follow-up questions to understand what it's doing. Or maybe you want to rewrite part of it so you do understand it. So the goal there is if you're going to use anything AI generated, please know what it does. And if you can't explain it to someone else and you don't understand it, don't use it. Um, and then as a last disclaimer, if you're unsure or need any clarification around any of the disclaimers, please reach out to your client manager because every client is different. Oops. And you just want to, if you're not sure sort of what the options are and what you're able to do, then please reach out and they can help assist you based on the project you're on and what is most appropriate in terms of tool usage.
Hey,
Uh,
Matt, Snehal has a
yes.
question.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just acknowledging his point about customer expectation because one of the colleague wanted to use Copilot with his own paid subscription, and when he reached out to our manager on the client side, we were surprised by the answer. So yeah, it's better to always like check with your client.
Yes, very good point. It's better to know and align expectation than to assume anything, certainly. Um, thank you. Any other comments before I start and get into the actual code? All right. Proceeding to the next slide. So the way I kind of have this set up is there's a few scenarios. I have five. I'll get through as many as I can. And I will kind of explain the background just so you have a rough idea of like what the problem was and then how I could potentially go about solving it. So scenario one, I call unit tests and refactor. And the problem is that you need to alter existing code, assume it's legacy code or code that you may have inherited or that you personally did not write, and maybe someone on your team also did not. And let's say it's difficult to read, it's difficult to understand, and has no test coverage whatsoever. So in this example, there is an order pipeline that I built that handles adding a shipping cost to orders. And in addition, it handles company-specific loyalty programs, taxes, discounts, etc. So I will share in the code really quick, and I'll kind of go through briefly what the code base looks like. It's quite simple, but just so you can have a rough idea of sort of what this is doing. So this is all in C sharp. Again, raise your hand or ask questions if needed. The code is not intended to be super high quality because the whole purpose is refactoring it, testing it, etc. in this case. But from a quick design perspective, we basically have a program file just kind of like simulating a behavior of taking a service, passing in an order that a customer has, processing it, and then I'm just outputting the results for now. So you can kind of see like at baseline, this is assuming what your customer's code is doing today or your own personal code. In this case, I'm going to go to the shipping service. This code is relatively straightforward as well, but by looking at it, there's basically one method called calculate shipping that takes in your order. Your order basically just has some flags. Imagine this kind of came out of a UI form. Is it international shipping, weight? Is it a premium shipping, total value? How many things are shipped? And what this method does is basically it's a very heavily nested if else statement that will return what the shipping should be. So while not super complex, you could know right off the bat that a lot of nesting ifs can get very difficult to kind of alter specifically, but also to sort of conceptually understand how this works. And if you had to modify it, risk of potentially making an error is quite high. This one has four levels of if nesting. So one, two, three, four. So in this example, we're supposed to basically make an alteration. But before I make any alteration, I'm presuming that I don't fully, understand it. I think it's kind of confusing to read, and I'd like to essentially make it better before I go through and even change any business requirements. So for this one here, the first step that I'm going to do is before I make any change to this, I want to ensure that I have unit test coverage because performing a large refactor on a code base of any level, even just a single file, is highly risky unless you know for a fact what that outcome is before you do anything with it, right? So in this case here, I have a question that I'm going to prompt into AI, and I will go through why I structured it like this. So and I'm copy pasting just from an ease of typing so that it doesn't, watch me type for 30, 40 seconds. But basically I say, can you please write tests for the shipping service? And then notice some of the key details I'm including using XUnit and Fluent assertions. I'm including this because our project as a team is using XUnit and they're also using Fluent assertions. And if I did not include details like this, you'll still get an output, but you're very likely going to get an output for default Microsoft assertions and probably not using XUnit. So this is one of those great things where you're thinking as an engineer, what kind of context do does this AI tool need to know to give me the result, hopefully the first time, rather than having to keep saying, oops, sorry, I'm using XUnit, and it prints it out. Oops, sorry, I'm using Fluent assertions. So you're kind of giving it the context. And again, if you had to integrate an IDE, it may understand that, but a lot of times I still find it beneficial to be explicit. So not only am I telling it those, I'm also telling it what I want it to do with these tests. I'm not telling it I just want tests. I'm going to say what I want them to look like and be formatted like. I'm saying that I want them clean, maintainable, and I want them to cover all use cases. I'm saying that I want it to use arrange, act, and assert comments to organize the tests. And that's the best practice I'm saying for this example team and project. I'm giving it the naming convention that I'd like to do, which is method under test, scenario, result. And I'm also saying I wanted to focus on business use case without being overly specific. So the reason I put that in is a lot of times if you don't tell it how you want this test to read, it's going to output something that will be very rigid. For example, if I was testing international greater weight and has premium and I wanted it to output this, if I don't tell it how I want it to not be overly specific, it's likely to say the result is 99.99 price or something like that. And the problem there is that as these prices change, the unit tests, if you forget to rename it, will become artifacts and misleading over time. So it's much better to focus on how the business thinks of these concepts when you name the tests so that you're tying your domain to the actual test itself. And you can kind of see an example of how that will look here. So before I get the tests, I'm going to copy the entire class in and its dependency of the order I will also paste in as well, and I will run it. So while this is outputting, I've already created a test project and I have its class here, but it's empty right now. I just kind of preemptively set it up so I can kind of paste it in as necessary. So you can see on the left pane, it is currently outputting. You can see how the bar is shrinking. That's kind of indicating that, the output's still printing. It's still going through all of its tests, still, writing it essentially. And it usually takes 15, 20 seconds, I'd say. But while it's outputting, you can kind of see some of the concepts with the naming. So it's saying stuff like, treat it as lightweight, treat it as heavyweight. You can see no discount. And even for the ones that are asserting on values, you can see it'll say stuff like returns high rate. So this is where you have the ability to start aligning with the business. So when the business is talking about, this value here that represented that collection of different flags being interpreted, you might want to rename this because maybe they'd call this like the extra expensive rate. And you name your tests so that when tests fail, the domain of what the business talks about and your expectation in code is unified. All right, so I have all of my tests. I'm going to copy the entire test file out. I'll get rid of its namespace since I don't need that. And I will save it. And it looks like it will at least compile. Um, so a caveat here. So pasting in all of these tests, right? Like even if they all run, that doesn't mean that I've tested every single use case, nor does that mean that these are well-structured tests or any of those other details. So the idea here is for this, I'm going to kind of brush over some of those concepts of like re-verification and stuff because it's time consuming. But again, normally you wouldn't just only paste it in and then run it and be like, well, they all passed. It must be great, right? You still have to use your skills as an engineer to kind of look at the tests, make sure they're structured right. Are you going to be able to maintain them? And do they cover all the use cases? And that might be a good scenario where you'd have a code coverage tool where after applying this, you could run it and then see if you are indeed at 100% coverage. And if you are, and your tests pass, then you are likely good. So I will run these. And for this, again, I'm going to assume that if they all run, then we covered all the use cases just from, again, a time perspective. So we basically have, all the tests pass. So we've got a baseline, and this is kind of what we're looking for. Now that we have our baseline, we're far more free to make refactors because once we refactor, I can rerun my tests and verify that the output is exactly the same, even though my code and my code structure has changed. And that's kind of the most important part of this is if you don't have a baseline, refactoring is terrifying, right? So in this case, I'm going to assume that these tests are good. And the next prompt I'm going to pass in is basically a refactor request. So I'd like it to refactor the shipping service to make it, and again, I'm defining here, you can see that I'm telling it what I value and what our team values and what our customer values for when it is looking to refactor this shipping service. So I'm thinking, historically, they've had very difficult to interpret code. So we're looking this time around. I want it to be more readable. I want it to be more easy to understand, robust to changes because historically changes have been difficult and easier to change in the future. I'm also including what are my options. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want it to actually give me a collection of options. I don't want it to just say, this is the one I decided to give you. I rolled my dice and this is the one you should use. I want to use my expertise as an engineer to be able to review the different outputs and pick which approach makes the most sense for my team, my customer, and which one I think will accomplish all of these the best. So I'm going to go back in and I'm going to actually paste this in again, and I'll explain why I did that. But basically, I found specifically in chat windows and IDEs, a lot of the time, as you talk about a certain class, and you might go through iterations of refactors, if you do not tell the AI tool where your code currently stands right now, it's very likely that it may pick up some iteration of a refactor or something you've talked about and assume that that is what your code looks like right now. And the recommendation it will give you will look very odd because it's using something that your code does not look like now. And again, if it was integrated in IDE, that might eliminate some of those. But again, I like the granular control of being able to say, by the way, it looks just like this right now. And then lastly, I'm asking for full output implementations of each. And the reason I'm doing that is because sometimes if you don't state this, it might just say like, here's 5 lines of code, dot, 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 dot. Here's 5 lines of code, dot, 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 with anything that is, basically doesn't compile, isn't defined. And at the end of the day becomes another prompt that you have to send in essentially. And I find also that the less prompts you can use and the more explicit you can use your engineering skills in its description, oftentimes the better response you'll get quicker, but not just quicker, you'll get a better response long term and avoid kind of like cyclical, please fix, please fix, please fix, where it starts to get sort of lost sometimes. So the first output, and I'll kind of go through it. It's saying maybe you could use guard clauses with easy return or early returns. So this one, I think, probably slightly more readable than the last one, but it also looks kind of similar in terms of, obviously reduced nesting, which is great. I think extensibility here would be a little difficult just because you have to figure out like where in this, am I placing my new behavior if I'm not just altering one. We have a strategy pattern here, which Again, this is another great thing to use as a learning tool, especially when you're outputting multiple things. If you don't know what a strategy pattern is, this is an opportunity to either Google or ask AI, what is a strategy pattern? This is actually a common code pattern that has a defined behavior. So if you searched this, you could see other examples and explanations, not just for what the pattern is, but how to actually use the pattern and what business and code problem this pattern is intended to actually solve. So kind of scroll through it. In this case, I'm thinking this is certainly overkill, right? Like we've got tons of classes, and this thing isn't that complicated. And this is probably even less readable than it is today. So I will skip it. Rules engine, another concept that is very common. If you search it on the internet, you will see. But basically, you've got shipping rules, you've got a calculator that will go through and basically, define your shipping rules, and it will find the shipping rule for you and calculate. I think it's probably overcomplicated again. Um, and it looks like, what is this one? Composite pattern with rate components. Let's see really quick what this looks like. It's saying it's not very clean. That's kind of interesting. And then we've got like a lookup table here as well. And this one's using, yeah, kind of like some magic keys and stuff. So I'm not a huge fan. This one here, it looks like is basically just a switch pattern for it. So I'm going to say for now, again, there's lots of different options, but I'm just going to go with this one for now. Let's say that I'm like, yeah, I like how it's defined here. This would be really easy to kind of test all of the edges and combinations. It's already handling ones that are undefined. This one, I think it looks relatively clean, let's say. So I will paste it over here. And it's saying it's already unreachable because all the options are already accommodated. So that's one of those scenarios there where like AI, is doing something that's essentially good, but it's also saying this would never be hit because all of the options are already defined. So if you didn't know, again, you could always copy that and be like, what does this mean? I don't understand why I have it. So I'll comment it out for now, just from simplicity standpoint. And I will rerun my tests and let's see if they still pass. I think they reran and they do. So you can see now, assuming I like this pattern more and I think it's easier to understand, and that's up to the engineer, we now have refactored something into, a whole different shape, completely different looking, and it should be very safe, assuming code coverage was solid and your unit tests are completely unchanged. I reran the same suite, didn't change a thing, and they still pass. Uh, so that is like the first part. I'll pause for a second if anyone had any questions thus far. All
I don't
right.
have a question, but just like a comment or I guess suggestion. But
Yep.
you have a lot of these like small paragraphs that you add to your chats for context.
Yep.
I wonder if do you have like these pasted somewhere that you just copy from like a notepad? Because these would be really helpful for me. Because what I
Yes.
tend to do is, yeah, if I'm writing a new prompt, I'm like, okay, I gotta add this stuff in. I don't have it pasted down anywhere, and I gotta rethink of what I did last time. It can be frustrating. So
Yes, 100%. So basically the question is like what all these things that kind of keep reappearing, do you kind of have like a playbook of things you could just copy over? And the answer is yes. I do keep track of the things that are kind of repetitious, and you'll see that more as I continue. And I think that's a great idea, especially across the team, because once you've kind of defined these, if everyone's using the same sort of definition as they paste it in, you're likely to get very similar output over and over again, which is another form of sort of unifying the code base across many engineers. So I think it's a really cool idea. I think I'd actually spoken to Jeff a little bit about this, but I think it'd be a really cool idea to sort of have a playbook of these, maybe in general, of successful type prompts that help navigate and get, quicker answers that are more unified across teams or even the company potentially. So, um, yeah, it's something we're kind of thinking about already in the back burner, but totally, yes, I think it's a great idea, Stephen. We should probably do it as a team too.
yeah, I was gonna say that'd be super helpful.
Yep. So I'll move on to one more refactor, and then I'll move on to our next completely brand new scenario. So the next layer is I have a an order service now. So the order service is basically calling that shipping service, and this one here has a bunch of company IDs where it's applying basically like unique logic based on these companies. So imagine I have like four customers that are completely unique that are using this, and they all have their own unique logic and how they apply shipping benefits and loyalty points. So you can see this is violating, many solid principles. It does not have a single responsibility. It's not, or for open and closed too, it's not really open for extension without, essentially modifying other things and potentially introducing bugs in other companies. So if I had to add a company 5, for example, there's a chance that I would accidentally break how company 2 worked, right? Which is not a good design for long-term stability. So for this one here, you'll notice, and this is kind of getting back to what Stephen had just referred to, I'm pasting in another prompt. So before I alter the order service, exactly the same. I essentially want it to use all of the same stuff. If you notice, X unit, Fluent assertions, how to structure my tests, more readable. And the thing up here that I also added, and again, I'm preemptively telling it, I said I do not want to use the real implementation for shipping service in my tests. I have a mocking library and I say what the library is as well. So when I paste this in, instead of it either assuming to use the real implementation or magically picking some mocking library, I'm saying, no, don't use the real one. Use mock and mock it. So if I paste this in here and I open my order summary, this is, again, I'm just trying to paste in like dependencies that this would need to understand. So this class really only has order summary. It has the shipping service and the order. So all the dependencies now are pasted in there. Yeah, so then let's run it. The goal here is to get another set of unit tests created for shipping service. And then we will see the refactor. And the refactor on this one should be slightly more interesting because it's a relatively common problem, I think. I've ran into many scenarios where you're hosting something for multiple companies and they'll have their own unique business logic being applied, and to try to find a way to, abstract it in a way that it's safer to make changes and easier to test is a great use of time, I think, especially for long-term stability. All right, so let's see if it's done outputting. So still writing the test. And again, remember, normally you wouldn't just copy, run it, and assume that everything's great. You should be diligent as an engineer and review its output and also its test coverage. Even if it claims it thinks it's 100%, you never know. Okay, so I'll paste this in. All right, it looks like it does compile, which even in itself to me is like magical. I remember a year or two ago with AI tools, you'd paste something in like this and there'd be like methods that didn't even exist and it wouldn't even compile. It's pretty magical. So we now have, I'm assuming, a full unit test coverage of this class at the before state before I touch a single line of code. So now I'd like to proceed with my refactor. And again, you'll notice, right, kind of templates it again. It's basically saying, I want it more readable, refactor, simpler. And also, please output full implementations for each. And what are my options? Because again, I want to know not just what you think is best, I want to decide as an engineer what is best. So let's paste it in. And let's see what it outputs for our refactor. Are there any questions while we're hanging and waiting for it to output? Alrighty. So the first one it says is a strategy pattern. Again, that's one of those words you can look up and understand what the approach is and why it exists. So I already know, I've seen it outputted before. To save time, I'm going to go with the strategy pattern. And the reason I personally liked it is basically what it's doing is it defines a strategy, which is like an interface. And then each company gets its own strategy with its own process order. And the beauty of this approach is that each company's logic is now encapsulated inside of a single class. And you are now able, if you wanted to, you could unit test each individual strategy, which is basically the business logic for each company by itself, because none of them are all intertwined like they used to be. So if I kind of scroll down to see what it actually was doing, basically all it's really doing right here is it's running process order. There's a defined list of strategies here, which is like our dictionary. And then all it's doing is basically saying like pass in the company ID, get back that interface that represents the company that it is, and then just run the logic. So this layer becomes super, super clean and easily testable. So let me paste this in really quick. I'm going to make this method public for now, just because it's kind of the current definition of the different strategies. So if I do this now and I attempt to run my unit tests, we'll see what happens. It's going to fail, right? So it's going to fail and it says expected at once, but it has 0 times. That's actually kind of interesting. How did this define its order service, shipping service, get default? Okay, so this is a good use case here. So let's say now all my tests ran, but something failed, right? So you've got 2 options. Of course, as an engineer, you should be able to just read your stack trace and kind of parse like what changed. But also alternatively, I could actually go in here, paste in the stack trace and say, now I'm getting an error on only this or this unit test, right? And kind of use it also to help debug its own code. And this isn't meant to hijack the engineer's ability, but a lot of times you try to solve it yourself if it's quick. And if you don't understand why the error happened or the stack trace, you could use it to kind of define what the problem is. So it says the exception is thrown early. The fails because the method was never invoked. Oh, it's because, yeah, it was an unknown company ID, right? So that kind of actually makes sense. So basically it's saying, um, let me double check. Yeah, like this isn't getting called because it never got the strategy, basically. So if I rerun it, I suspect it's probably fine now. Yeah, and like this is one of those examples where behaviorally nothing really changed. It's just the difference now of if I can't get the strategy, there was no point never even trying to calculate the shipping costs from the shipping service because if the company doesn't exist, even if I calculate the shipping costs, it would have never succeeded anyways. So this is an example of like a minor change to your unit test, but behaviorally, it's essentially exactly the same. The exception's slightly different, but this exception's probably more meaningful than the last one was anyways. So yeah, reran, they're all good. If I want to be super diligent, I could rerun this too and, like output really quick as like the whole project. My one example I kind of had here. So I look at that JSON here and I compare it to the original and just double check, true, 56 true, 1900, 190. Yep. So the same output. All right. So are there any questions? That's kind of the main example of the refactor and unit test combination. And that is scenario 1. Are there any questions on this specific one? All right. So let's hop to a new one. The next one is creating a Microsoft SQL report using business requirements. So in this problem, I want you to assume that a customer wants a report using MS SQL data in an unfamiliar database. Let's say you just joined the team, you're 2 weeks in, there's a schema, you don't understand it, but the customer has requested that you retrieve some data from SQL for it, right? And a customer provides you with business requirements for the data they would like, and we need to translate the requirements into a report for the customer. So for this one, I'm going to hop out. I'm going to hop back into here, and I will paste in what my customer has given me for business requirements. And I will briefly kind of explain what it is. But imagine you kind of got this email. So they're basically saying, they need a product performance and inventory management report and the customer's kind of telling you what they need. They're saying, I need the name and the category, total revenue for each product being sold, how many units, discounts applied. They wanted some other things like, how many units are still in stock, some pricing analysis, current list price, average price, and then how they kind of want to see it sorted. So I want you to assume now that you're kind of in this database you don't fully understand yet. It might have a pretty complex use case. And, um, of course, in the real world, you should still be using UML diagrams. You should be trying to understand the entire schema that's being used. But for this, there's a pretty cool way that you could basically go in and, so really quick, I should explain. Right click, tasks, generate scripts. You can generate basically the entire schema, and I'm including views and stored procs because when I want AI to generate this, I want it to use what it thinks is most appropriate. And when I do this, this is basically going to generate the entire schema of the database. Now, here's another one of those disclaimers again. You'd have to evaluate, is pasting an entire schema in an AI tool a good idea or not, right? And that's sort of up to what the schema looks like, how it's exposed, customers' comfort. But I'm just giving a use case of something where this could be highly useful. So you can see it outputs it here. This is the entire database schema from the Northwind database, which is like a Microsoft SQL test database. And it has, all the different constraints. It has all of the tables, the views, the stored procedures. So I'm going to copy it out and I'm going to paste the entire schema into here. And all I'm going to ask is, can you please generate SQL that will create the following report given the attached database schema and business requirements? So it starts printing it out. And again, I didn't really tell it anything, right? I basically just gave it the schema and it generates this report here. So I'm going to copy it. And next disclaimer, if you ever have any SQL that is ever generated by AI, never run it right off the bat. You're always wanting to look for anything that looks nefarious. For example, if there's any dynamically generated T-SQL, if you see any updates or deletes or anything that's doing something other than just reading data, then that would be a high raise of concern unless you're intentionally looking to do that. And if you are, always wrap it and begin transactions and roll it back to be very careful. So in this case, you could kind of do a search like, am I doing any updates? Am I doing any deletes? Is there any T-SQL? And I scroll through and there's not. The other thing you could potentially think about is like, could I be locking tables? And I could always, as an engineer, be like, oh, by the way, I want it never to lock a table because I could still freeze up a database if I wasn't. So I'll add some no locks. I'll execute it. And from a comparison standpoint, this should be probably very similar. So if we looked super briefly again, trying to be conscious of time, it wants a name, category, and supplier. So name, category, supplier. It wanted total revenue, total units, and average discount. Total revenue, total units, average discount. Scroll to the side. And this was, the units, the reorder, inventory, current, and average selling price. So basically, with no real prompting and just business requirements, we have a SQL query that gets them the report, right? And again, disclaimer, you should still always review it, double check your business requirements. This isn't meant to just say, oh, it gave me results back. It's great, right? Like you need to still use your skills that you had before AI were here to make sure that what you're actually getting and outputting is actually good and a good idea. So you hand this over to your client, they love the report. And now the next step, though, is they now decided they liked it so much that they want to display the report in a UI. So after seeing the report and its value for the business, they decided that they would like to build a new web page that displays this report. Now, I'm assuming in this use case here that our company has a preference of trying to keep all of the SQL inside of Entity Framework Link if possible, so it could be swapped over between database providers if needed. So I don't want to just copy the SQL in. I essentially want it to actually use Entity Framework, hopefully, and magically get the same query right into my code, right? So what I'm going to do for this one is I'll paste in another chat. So my goal now is convert this into LINQ so I can use this in C#. So I said, can you now generate LINQ to use Entity Framework Core for the same query? Please ensure the code is written into a repository class. So again, look at what I'm doing here when I say this stuff. You don't have to include these kind of details, but if you do not, you're going to spend a lot more time iterating with AI to get what you want, where thinking ahead in an additional sentence or two could likely save you 20 minutes of fiddling in a cycle or a circle with AI. Because once you kind of get off track, trying to get it back on track is way harder than to try to get it on track the first time. And then the database context. So for this one, I'm going back to my example project. I have a second project down here that I've already created the database context for Entity Framework. So this is the context defining all of the tables in that same database that we just saw. So I'm going to copy the entire context in here, and I'm going to paste it in. So now it's going to use the SQL that it generated to then use the context in the code to convert that same SQL query now into LINQ, which is not raw SQL anymore. So let's see what it does. So it's creating a report object that represents all of the columns that we had seen before. It's creating a repository interface. Great. And then it looks like it's generating right here the equivalency LINQ, hopefully, of what we just saw. So now I will paste this in. It called it, I think it was product performance repository. Fingers crossed that this was actually correct. And of course, I wouldn't normally just paste this all in one class. You'd want separate files, better, structures and stuff like that. I don't want its namespace. I'm just using my own. So I'll get rid of that. And looks like it's duplicating, but it'll clean that up. So there are some warnings about null differences. For this, again, I'm going to ignore it just from like a time perspective, but these are things that you should certainly investigate. You don't want null possibilities here, especially if you're getting runtime exceptions. So basically now I'm going to go into, this is just like my program run essentially. So I will create a new product repository, pass in the context, and then let's get the results. So equals await. And I'm going to just run this now and hopefully do a comparison to the SQL results and see if the results that came out were similar. So I will pull this over to the left and unpin this. And if I hover over the results, so the first thing is I see 77 count here and a 77 row count here. So at least the same number. The first one that comes out is for Codier de Blay. I'm not sure how to say it. And that's the first row in the original SQL report. If I go into here, it's for this company, which is the second over there. And then like another quick sanity check is like, let's go to the last record and let's see if it ended the same too, right? So I go down here. It's for Chocolade product. So if I go to the bottom in my SQL, right here. So basically, this entire SQL here was able to be converted directly into LINQ by only using the context, by pasting in the context from Entity Framework. That simple. And again, it's really cool because the time savings of this would likely be massive. Even just to convert this into LINQ, even if you were familiar, would likely take a long time, right? And is this sufficient? Maybe. You should check the query plan. You should see what it's actually outputting. But again, super big win, especially when you're not creating anything new. You're just converting it from one type to another, essentially. Any questions on this one? All right. The next scenario is, I call this the raw data scenario. This one's actually been very useful for myself personally, and I think potentially it could be very useful for a lot of people. So the problem in this scenario is it's an imaginary system outage that occurred, and there are various parties that want a summary of what happened and its resolution. Each party has a different technical level and wants specific information about the outage. So the example is that an outage occurred in a public-facing application. The development team documented their debugging process, located the bug, and then they fixed it. They now need to report the information to a customer's non-technical CEO, the internal development team, and the team's manager. So I've had in a lot of situations where sometimes, you'll fix an outage, you'll fix anything, and then someone will be like, hey, can you tell me what happened? You handwrite what happened, and then you might have to deliver the same message now to someone else. And then you have to deliver the same message to someone else, right? And you kind of get in a situation where you're writing a lot of the same things multiple times in multiple different ways. So the raw data example is meant to provide a very cool way, essentially, to essentially have AI help you write many different versions very simply. So I'm going to paste in an example of this failing use case. It's kind of wonky formatting. But basically, I'm imagining that this engineer wrote all of these things for what happened. So basically, they discovered an outage at 412. They found this stack trace about what happened, and then they started doing some stuff. They checked like, oh, is SQL in the outage here? We don't know what the cause was yet, but basically, is SQL Server online? Yes. Are we able to retrieve users from the users table? No. When they tried to do it, it never completes the query. So then I'm saying, they suspected they may have ran out of memory. They checked, the memory was still fine. They checked indexes, index fragmentation was fine. So then they checked for locked tables at 502. And they found out that there was an issue. One of the tables was locked. And they basically killed it to fix prod immediately. And then they went in and they found out that if there was an exception in the code during the transaction that was open, it never rolled it back, and it basically kept a transaction open and froze the user's table. So the engineering team at 8:10 finally deployed and verified that their fix to ensure that a permanent table lock could never occur, because if an exception occurred in code, the SQL is getting rolled back. So now everyone wants to know essentially what happens. So at the very top, and I call this kind of data, this is raw data, right? Like if you sent this to a non-technical person, they would look at this and be like, I don't know anything you're talking about, nor do I care about any of this, right? Like they would want to know specifics. So in this case, I use my raw data and then I tell AI what kind of stuff I want it to look for. So for the non-technical CEO, I want them to focus on the flow, the resolution, and what happened, and include timestamps of notable events. For the internal team, focus on technical details. Next step, the bugs. What did we learn? And then for the internal management or the internal manager, which is like the developer's manager, focus on what happened, how it impacted the customers, and the steps that are being performed to ensure it won't happen again. So right here, I'm basically saying I want, to rewrite this using my raw data for 3 different stakeholders. And the cool thing is when you look at raw data can be converted into many, many different ways. But the problem is if you write up your write up as high level data, you can never take high level to get granular. But if you have granular, you can always scale it back and convert it into various levels of less technicality. But without the raw data, you can't build and repurpose something in many different ways. So here's kind of like a quick example. This is for, the CEO. It's basically saying, here's the executive summary. Here are the timeline of all the events so they know when things are out and when things came back. You could see like the definition's relatively straightforward, defect in our login process. Still pretty high level here. And then like, what did we do? They fixed the code, and then an apology. Engineering team, you could see this one's a little more elaborate where it's like, hey, I found in application insights, we found this error, and then we checked these things and they all looked good. But then we found the root cause at this point. And technically what we did is we actually first, killed the session that was blocking. And then, it's highlighting, oh, there was a defect, and we found out where it was. And it was these lines of code that had our defect. And what did we change? So you can see this one's using a lot of my raw data to be able to explain it to them. And then the last one is for the engineering manager. Again, this is sort of like what happened to the customer? How was the customer impacted? What happened to the like what happened during that outage? What did like the general resolution look like? So again, the intention isn't to just be like, wow, it wrote all my stuff, copy paste it in. It's to give you an idea, and you might go through these, delete some stuff, reword it, but you save so much time by not having to remember everything and rewrite over and over and over the same kind of thing, but repurposing it for many different parties. As long as you have your raw data, you can even reprompt and kind of refine this over time too, and spend far less time and give far better descriptions with way less effort on the engineer or business analyst. It could be anyone essentially. So, any questions on this one? Cool. Another one is the code review assistance. So the problem here is that pull requests can often be time consuming to provide proper guidance on alternative solutions and bug resolutions. Oftentimes, a code example and an explanation provide far more actionable feedback than comments alone. So I'm sure everyone's been in a scenario for, code reviews where if you say something like, hey, can you make these into constants? There's a lot of ambiguity left on the table. Where should the constants go? Maybe the engineer's new and doesn't know what a constant is. And there's a lot of potential back and forth that can happen in a code review. Whereas if you had an explicit piece of code that you could kind of like snip it out and show them, it would probably save them tons and tons of time and provide a better learning opportunity as well. So an engineer example created a pull request. You notice there are several issues. There are magic strings, repetition, and no compile time warnings on property access in Angular. So in this scenario here, I will swap back over into the AI tool. Looks like it froze or it just doesn't want to move. That's fine. So I will paste in my question here and basically say, is there a better way to handle validation? And you'll notice in this one, I'm actually telling it what I noticed as a person reviewing the code. I'm saying I noticed, username is being repeated and does not leverage Angular's native validation. I've also noticed that local storage are being set with magic strings multiple times. And then I'm telling it if the keys ever changed, then a bug could be introduced if both locations aren't changed. Can you show me the example of how to remedy both of these? I'm looking for simple, pragmatic, and a maintainable solution. So here I will paste in the example code and I will pop it up briefly. It's probably almost unreadable, I'm guessing, but I'll try to highlight if you can see at least some of it. But basically, some of the repetition I was referring to is like on this line on submit, it's doing a validation on username length. And then also on forgot password, the exact same username length is here. And then there's these local storage where it's getting the token, the user, the login time and stuff. And it's defining them here with these magic strings of token, user, login time. And then when user preferences are saved, it's also defining the exact same things down here. So there's a lot of redundancy. It's not very dry, and it's not really leveraging what we want as thorough engineers. So I will paste this in. See if it'll resize. Cool. So then you could see here, it goes create a constants file for magic strings, create a storage service. So you've got like the concepts are now being wrapped. So the saving of the login data is now abstracted into a single location so that you can call this many different places in code without having to keep redefine that structure and logic. It's creating validation constants. And then the refactored component this time using reactive forms. So you can see right here, it started using a single validation and basically an actual form builder in Angular, which is like the more proper way, because then you can basically just say like, is my field valid? And it will use these validation rules defined here to tell you yes or no. So when we look at the code now, it's far simpler. It's basically saying like, is the login form invalid? And then down here, it's calling the storage service, save the login data. And then on forgot password, it's doing something similar here where it's, looking at the validation limits and still using these well-defined constants here to define the same sort of validation rules that were present above. This could actually probably be cleaned up. There's got to be a way to singularly basically validate the login username. But again, the idea here is that now if I was in a PR, I could kind of go like, hey, like copy this. Let's make these into constants like this. And I paste it in. And then in the storage service, be like, hey, we might want to consider actually putting this in a service if there's a chance that we're going to use this in other pieces of code. It might look something like this, and then paste it in. And the idea isn't that this has provided me with any new ideas. It hasn't changed my mind or blown my mind, but I'm using it as an engineer. I knew I was looking for certain things. And for me to go and check out the code and handwrite and then copy that over to explain the things I already knew would take me a long time to do. But by doing something like this, I can get working code that are great examples. And again, assuming I review it and I might change it, I'm not just going to verbatim use it, but you're giving these people specifics in a much quicker way than you would if you had to go in and hand write this and copy it to them. Or if you just said, hey, make this a storage service and inject it. And then if you do something like that, you never know what the outcome is going to be. They might do something like you were thinking, or they might do something way different that requires a whole nother round of essentially, you know, talking over it again, I guess. So I know we're pretty much at time, so I won't have time for my last example, but I kind of just briefly explained what it was going to be had there been time. So really quick, this is exploring design and complex problems while you're away from your computer. So oftentimes ideas come to engineers while they're on walks or after working hours. Using a voice chat with AI can allow an engineer to proceed with their current tasks while mulling over various options. The example was an engineer is on a walk at lunch and evaluating the complexities of SQL 2012 to SQL 2014 upgrade. They want to understand some issues they may run into so they can start planning on how to resolve them. And the idea is, and again, since I don't have time, I won't do it. But with Claude, I can use my phone and I can basically turn on a voice chat where I can speak into my phone and ask it, like, hey, I want to do this and this, and I'm trying to upgrade. And then it will respond back also in voice. So you can essentially have a conversation. You can just put on your headphones and have like a 20-minute conversation to kind of get your brain thinking and working and evaluating complexities without having to sit there on a walk and type or have to be physically at a keyboard. You can explore ideas and kind of get initial plans anywhere, which is super cool. So I will end it there. But yeah, the last page, just kind of the conclusion. So, uh, you know, the goal was kind of how to prompt AI tools to get the values and the results you want. Never trust AI's output. You're an engineer for a reason. You were here before the AI tools existed. It's a tool. It's not meant to replace you. So use yourself and you guide it. They can be helpful, but they can also lead you into unnecessary time spent in the tool. If you ever find yourself getting frustrated, take a break. You probably can solve it faster than it can in that case, or at least reevaluate. And lastly, just be creative. There are many other ways to use AI tools that can help you find solutions quicker, better designs and architecture, and enhance your learning. You don't always just have to copy the results. Spend some time asking it questions. Google, figure out what it's doing and why, and make yourself a better engineer. That is the end. I thank everyone for attending. If anyone has any questions or would like to stay after, I am here. So,
Thank you, Matt. That was awesome.
Thanks, Matt.
yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.